I'd like to welcome you all and our panelists this afternoon. We're going to be talking about from regulator and stakeholder to partner and supporter. First of all, I'd like to introduce our two panelists this afternoon. On my far left, we have Jeff Geipel from Engineers Without Borders, founder and managing director of the mining shared value at Engineers Without Borders Canada. And he spends a lot of his time developing in the extractive industries around the world with companies and people looking to improve, in particular, their local procurement practices. He also does many other things, and when we were talking earlier today, he surprised me by saying his vacations are in places like North Korea and Iraq. So anyway, thank you, Jeff.
You can only go down from here, I think.
And then secondly, many of you have heard a couple of times today from Steve. Chairman of Integra Resources, GFG Resources, and also he a little earlier was involved with the founding of Disrupt Mining with Goldcorp a little while ago. So thank you, both of you.
Thank you.
So the objective this afternoon will be to talk a little bit about, in a world full of, a natural resources world full of license to operate and ESG and so on, what are some of the opportunities to really change how we are successful there? What types of frameworks and partnerships can we change or create that make a real difference? So I'd like to just start with questions for both of you. Jeff, how do you think we can change the nature of our relationships with the regulators, particularly in the light of so much automation and technology?
Mm-hmm. I would say it's not a question of how can we change it. I think it's a must change. I think if you look at the incredible rate of change in what communities expect, what governments expect from mining, I think it's the new normal, whether that be in Canada or Australia with Indigenous communities demanding more, but also in the case of African countries, virtually every single country, as they redo their mining code, is adding things like local content requirements. So I think it is the new normal, and I think the industry would be wise to get ahead of that. And in terms of how industry can adapt to that and things like automation, I think usually our message is to say you need to understand your impacts in greater detail than currently are being understood. On the procurement side, I don't think most mining companies are able to really understand which of their procurement spends are going to be affected by automation and which ones are not. And if they don't understand that, when they lower economic impacts in a drastic way in a host country, that's going to cause problems.
Okay. And Steve?
So the bulk of my experience in development is in Quebec, which is where we were in Quebec is about as mining friendly as you can get. We took an asset through kind of exploration, through permitting, development, construction, through that period or through that process. And what we found, and it's very simple, is kind of stakeholders, regulators, whoever it may be, and again, we're working in a very friendly, mining-friendly jurisdiction, is you have to always just approach the problem from kind of what is the person across the table from you thinking, and how are they looking at either the problem or the solution that you're presenting to them. And whether it's a mine site that's kind of needs to disrupt a community for its operations, or you need to get your permits through, or whatever it may be, kind of if we as mining companies, we in the industry are able to put ourselves in the shoes of the people we're talking to, be it Indigenous groups, environmental groups, communities in general, I think if we approach our decision-making process with that mentality, and it's very simple, I think it's not just mining, any sort of discussion should kind of start from that side. I think we'd be surprised by the outcome of that. I think what we tend to do is we as an industry, we approach problems from what is the bare minimum, what do we have to do to kind of what boxes do we have to tick to get regulator support, to get stakeholder support, whatever it may be. And in my own limited experience going through that stage, Indigenous groups specifically, all they want to do is sit down and have a discussion about kind of what your mine is doing, and they want honest answers, and if those answers change, they want to be told ahead of time. They don't want you to just come through and you have the mentality of, I need to tick the Indigenous box and then move on to the next problem. So I think I don't actually think it's that difficult. There's always going to be difficulties through any process because there's some groups that are fundamentally against mining and development of natural resources, and we're always going to have to deal with that. But I think if we can take that mindset into how we approach our permitting and construction development, that entire discussion, I think we'd see a lot of positive things come from that.
So in terms of, I think I hear you both say that engaging with local communities, whether it be First Nations or groups in any of our host countries is one thing, but then in terms of engaging with the regulatory groups, whether they be the parastatals or the NGOs or the local regional governments, etc., how would you view those? Is that sometimes a duplicative effect when you're working with all of those different levels? And what are the ways to improve there?
I mean, I think that's very, very context specific. So, I mean, certain governments are happy to just collect the tax revenue and don't really care about the rest. And then other governments really are demanding lots. So I think it's extremely context specific. And I think that's kind of maybe the overarching way to approach this is to understand the government requirements. But again, if you don't understand what the government is looking for in terms of procurement, hiring, taxes, if you don't have that information able to convey to them as to what you're doing, I think you're going to be quite in trouble. And so just as a practical example, we're working in Zambia right now, and in one case, a company was able to show where their spending was going in really detailed amounts, sort of their tier 1 suppliers to tier 2 suppliers, and they were able to use that to negotiate with the government on what's going to happen next. Other companies in that same country, some of them Canadian big companies, just did not have the basic information as to what they were doing in terms of spending impacts. And they're completely at the mercy of the government saying, you need to buy 40% local, because if you can't prove you can't buy 40% local, what else are you going to do?
I think I would say in that entire process, start to finish, the earlier the better. The earlier those discussions take place, the better. We live in a world where information is out there, and I don't think we can sort of game the system and find ways to all engage this group at this point in time and engage this group at this point of the time. And I don't think any of us are that good at our jobs or can understand the entire spectrum of the various stakeholders that need to buy into what we're trying to accomplish for us to achieve it. So I think my view is the earlier the better. It's treat it as everyone's going to be able to see your site the entire way through start to finish. The earlier we can get stakeholder buy-in, the earlier you can approach and deal with issues and problems, the better it is. An example I would give is when we were building our asset in Val-d'Or, Val-d'Or is built around 2 mines, and those mines kind of shut down in the 80s, one in the 80s and one in the 90s, and then a few different groups came through and tried to restart them, and they went bankrupt one after the other. So we came in, and we were 2 kilometers away, but still sort of painted with the same brush. So the first thing that happened was everybody hated us right out of the gate, because this is bankruptcy number 3 coming down the road. We now have a big open pit in the middle of our town that went bankrupt and was never reclaimed. Can't wait to hear what you guys want to tell us. So we approached it early, and we did a community meeting once we started to have some success, really early, still at the exploration stage. And what we found was the community had started to buy in, but you had these very loud voices in the room. One of them for us was the hotel owner, who the previous operators were literally mining about 100 meters below the hotel. You can imagine why he didn't want a mining company to come back in. But over about a 3-year process, he ended up becoming the chair of our consultation committee. And for a person that stood up and yelled in a public meeting to see 3 years later kind of engaged and helping support us, it was really just talking to him. And it was doing so at an earlier stage. And when it finally came down to the official community consultation part of the project, he was right there supporting it. And at the end, we actually didn't have a single person in the community stand up and say, we don't want to see this mine be built.
I think that's one of the really important things around the whole change process, engagement and change, is being able to identify as early as possible who are those real influencers, who are going, if you can bring them into the discussion early enough and engage them and help them answer questions, then a better chance of being successful. One of the things I was hearing earlier was that oftentimes when it comes to our stakeholder or community groups, they themselves are better connected than we are. They understand different types of technology, social media, information, grapevines, whatever it is. How do you think it is that we could do, as a mining industry, do a better job of tapping into those communication networks and participating early or influencing through those?
I guess my tip, and I'm an NGO guy, so maybe take my words with a grain of salt, but I think that the kind of time of flashy PR, I think, is rapidly coming to an end. I don't think you can really pull off the kinds of things that companies used to be able to do in terms of, we create X amount of jobs and that kind of thing. And you've seen, whether this be the Keystone Pipeline or the Trans Mountain Pipeline in Canada, if you claim a certain amount of jobs are going to be created and that's not true, you're not going to get away with that, I think. So I would say, in terms of a general comment, that when it comes to social media communications, I think you need to assume a much higher level of knowledge among your stakeholders. And that's not just, that's in Canada, that's in Africa, that's everywhere. And it's only going to be more and more the case. So I think that would be probably my main message. But I think also, speaking to framing things as a net positive or a net negative equation, I think is a better way of doing it. If you simply just say, we're going to create X amount of jobs, but you are not honest about some of the other things that might happen, something negative, for example, I think people will see through that. So I think it's better to frame these things as here's the deal we're offering you. It's going to require these few things are going to happen that might not be positive, but we're going to create X amount of jobs, for example. I think that is a much more honest and sustainable way of engagement than sort of a flashy PowerPoint about all the benefits that are going to come. Because again, I think those days are somewhat over, and I think we've seen, especially in the Trans Mountain Pipeline in BC, where I'm from. That's not going to get built, and I think it's because they overestimated how much they could sell that pipeline via nice messages.
I think social media is the latest medium to communicate a message. I don't think it's the answer to anything. I think it's more, we need to even back that up a little bit and look at sort of what are we in an industry trying to convey. We're always going to have to deal with the fact that the Mount Poly tailing spill is a much sexier headline than the 1,000 jobs you created. And so you're sort of dealing with that. We're always, to a certain extent, we're always going to have kind of a certain portion of the media and other groups against what we do, because that's just the nature of our business, and there's risks with our business. I don't think there's any sort of social media or any one individual platform that can work for or against us. I think it's more kind of what is the message that you use social media and any other communications platform to get across. And I think we as an industry need to continue, and we do it, but I think we need to continue to work together to come to really show, and we have to work hard to do it, to really show the benefits of mining. And there's a few examples earlier today when you're talking about 20-year-old kids who just don't know have any idea what mining is. And they picture a donkey and a pickaxe. And there are a ton of benefits to mining and the economies and the sub-economies and the direct and indirect jobs. And there are so many benefits that come from mining. I think that we need to really work hard to use social media, but use other platforms, whatever it may be, to communicate that mining is not evil. Mining is a good thing. And a lot of people would be surprised at sort of how much of their own economies that they rely on are dependent on mining. So I think not to discount social media or anything like that, but I don't think we're going to find that there is any one Snapchat, Instagram, whatever it may be, that's going to have our answers. If Instagram is a social media platform that's used to kind of communicate via pictures, kind of what are the pictures that we as an industry are really trying to present to the general public?
I might just add really quickly that, millennials in particular, mean, it's all about climate change, and the reality is, and as an NGO person who works with mining, you know, I get a few crusty NGO partners who are, you know, why are you working with mining? But we need copper and we need lithium to deal with the technologies that are going to get us off oil and gas. That's just the reality. So I think, you know, don't do it dishonestly, but ultimately we need these minerals for the carbon transition. So I think that's a real angle to take, and I think it'll probably be one of the more successful angles to take over, you know, other benefits that mining creates.
And I think one thing I should add to that too is, I don't think we just need to communicate. I think we actually need to clean up as an industry as a whole as well. I think there's still too much. I think the polite word is noise, but there's too much out there that happens because we're not. And I don't mind we as the people in this room, but whether we like it or not, the mining industry, there's a lot of bad. There's for every really good success story, there's a few kind of bad stories as well, where things haven't worked out and dishonest people did dishonest things, and whether it was the environment or a community or someone suffered from that. I think we need to find new ways within our own industry to combat that, because if we don't, what'll happen is it'll be sort of the NGO groups or whatever group will be the ones to point that out, and those, whether we like it or not, make for very sexy headlines.
So if you're looking then at different types of frameworks to help guide companies or groups that are trying to achieve some of these benefits, you know, which ones would you point us to? Because there are certainly a lot. There are high-level ones, multi-government, multilateral. There are much more sort of foundation or smaller NGO-driven frameworks. Can you name some that we should be looking to?
I mean, I think they're all basically the same idea of sharing information, whether that be the Global Reporting Initiative, or we have our own, we worked with GIZ to make a local procurement specific reporting initiative. I think they're all, you know, essentially the same idea. I think the issue is actually getting it used. And right now, I think when I talk to mining companies, they view reporting as just a giant pain. And actually, reporting can be a massive tool to create business value. If you're communicating what you're doing, but you're not actually bothering to get it out to the community and then use that to harness partners, I mean, it's kind of a pointless exercise. And so, whether this be local hiring or local procurement or any of these issues, if you actually report the information and then try to use that to crowd in support government funding, in the case of developing countries, aid funding, I mean, there's money out there that can be used to help you train your employees, you train your suppliers, for example. So I think it's not, the frameworks are kind of there's, you know, anyone will do if they kind of cover all the bases. I think it's more about how you use the reporting than it is just the actual framework.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, partly because I don't think I could name a specific framework. But my own experience was, again, going back to Quebec, is we brought in a big firm. We used AMEC for part of that process, and we essentially outlined what are the different groups that we need to, both the Indigenous groups, community groups, and what are the various levels of government, right across the board. And what we really found is we didn't really apply a framework to it. We just made sure that every person on that list was kind of having their voice heard. But what we found, and again, we were very close to a community. We're a few kilometers away, so we're close to that community. But what we found is actually the most powerful tool that we developed was our company culture. And we had such a strong culture, and it's something to this day very proud of with what that company has become, that every person that sort of interacted with somebody whose family member or friend, whoever worked with our company, is now turning around and sort of promoting that. And the mining community is a very small community, and the communities we operate in are often quite small as well. And if your company culture, first starting internally, but you're able to broadcast that out, that is, to me, the most powerful, way more powerful than any framework or anything else. Val-d'Or is a community of 35,000 people, and for the 300 job positions that went up 6 months ago, they had just over 4,000 applicants for it. And I think that in itself speaks to the culture that still lives on through there. And that really, again, your government regulators are often people who live in or have family members who live in these communities. And whether we like it or not, gossip can be your kind of best or worst friend, but you can use it to your advantage.
So do you think it's different than if you're in a greenfields environment in a jurisdiction that doesn't have a history of extractive industry, or do you think that, compared to, say, Val-d'Or, where there's a rich history, would you approach it in a different way?
I think it's being the eternal optimist. I think you have a clean slate to work with in greenfield, so you'd think that maybe that works to your advantage. That being said, everybody on the planet, I believe, has some sort of view on mining, good or bad, and whether or not it's a greenfields area that has an experience in mining, the people are ultimately going to make the decisions to push a project forward both internally within a company or various stakeholders. I'm sure are coming to that decision time with some sort of bias, but I would think greenfields more than anything else it's a clean slate. It's difficult in that you're often dealing with less sophisticated stakeholders who don't have as much experience, and kind of cyanide in itself is a very terrifying thing. If you don't know, it sits within a closed system, things like that. But no, I would say that greenfields is kind of almost where most of the opportunity lies, and there's plenty of examples. Say a lot of the work that Agnico's doing in way up north, and others where they've had a ton of success.
I would add, I think it's a huge advantage, because maybe not so much North America, but if you're working in sub-Saharan Africa, the reputation of mining is not going to be good, and it's fairly deserved, I think, in terms of how much has actually benefited from mining. So we see countries like Kenya, Ethiopia trying to get into mining for the first time, and I think, yes, greenfield is the opportunity, but I think you almost have to come at it from a perspective of saying, this is a chance to get it right. I think if you don't admit that in the past, countries like the Congo and Zambia have not fully benefited from the resources, I think you're going to, again, put up a barrier right away. But if you can simply come in and say, this is our chance to make mining a model industry for our country, whether this be Kenya or Uganda for that matter, I think it's a real opportunity that doesn't exist if you're in the Congo, where, let's face it, there's mine sites that look like the moon. I think it's not going to be very easy to convince locals that that's a great industry.
And I think, to add to that, I completely agree. I think we often get defensive, and I don't think we should, because maybe it wasn't us individually that made those decisions that led to the moon site, whatever it may be, but it happens and it exists. And kind of what we should be doing is kind of listening and finding ways to change it to prevent it from happening again. I think if we're defensive and we just continue to be defensive of the mining industry and our role in the economy and in the world, there'll be a lot of walls that go up in our face as we're trying to come. Essentially, we're here to talk about the future of mining, and as we go and try to push forward with whatever the future of mining looks like, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that mining hasn't always been sort of the best corporate citizen.
Sure. So we've talked a bit about some of the ways to engage communities and stakeholders in the natural resources or extractive sector. And we've talked a little bit about how we might communicate the benefits. As we're looking at the future of mining and how it could really change, maybe some major changes, whether it be, entirely autonomous mines like in the movies or so on. What do you think we can do better to explain those benefits?
I mean, I think, to me, it's about understanding what's going to happen. I think that, when you think of an autonomous mine, you think, okay, we're going to lose whatever it is, half our employees, 70% of our employees. But what people don't realize is that's half the employees, that's also half the uniforms, half the camp services, half the hotel services, half the flights half the internal flights in country. I mean, there's a lot of spin-off benefits that are lost when this happens. And I think if you don't understand that, you're going to be in real trouble. And I think the way to get ahead of this is to understand which parts of my hiring and which parts of my procurement and which parts of my tax dollars are going to be affected by automation, for example. So there's no point of spending time building up suppliers of a good that's going to be automated out of existence, for example, right? Whereas grinding media, we can automate, but we're not going to get rid of grinding media. So grinding media is a product which makes sense to try to target as a local good that could be supplied, for example. So I think that, to me, is the way to deal with this, is to understand the impacts and to get ahead of them and make a plan so that you're not left kind of holding the bag of an angry community saying, where's our benefits?
Well, some of these would be very longer term programs. We're going to potentially automate out maybe highly repetitive work, but there will still be I would anticipate lots of work that's really much more human-centric, where you're solving problems, you're working in teams, you're developing your groups of people and communities. So how would we go about creating those more, the capability for these more human-centric roles?
You know what, actually, just before that, on the communication side, to your earlier question, one thing I just want to add to that, I think as an industry, we need to acknowledge that how people process information today is very different than how they processed information 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And how do we communicate the benefits to what we do? How do we attract people to our industry and communicate why mining is not the worst thing? I think looking at how sort of even you just digest your news and other things, it's sort of a series of headlines. You get any news article now comes with a little piece at the top that says this will take you 2.3 minutes to read. You have sort of 60 to 90 seconds of anyone's attention span. But we as an industry, and this is more on the corporate side, I think continue to come up with our own ways to present, be it through long press releases or whatever it may be, to present what each of us individually are doing. And when we look at that as a whole, how is anybody, and I think we oversimplify and we say, millennials, how are they going to understand what we do? I don't think it's millennials. I think everybody, kind of top to bottom, is digesting information differently in the past. How is anybody ever going to understand what we do? And we can talk about kind of communicating the benefits of mining, but we're at a point where people don't even understand what mining is in the first place. So my view on that is we need to find ways to sort of break down and really simplify what we do. And I don't like the term dumb it down, but to simplify and articulate in a very short amount of time exactly what we do as an industry. And to do that, I think we first need to normalize the data set a little bit, kind of where we're presenting and I don't mean we all use all-in sustaining costs, where we kind of use similar terminology or similar even diagrams and things like that to communicate what we do. And I think if we can provide the world with a basic understanding of mining, the next step in that is going to be kind of teaching them about the benefits in that, and then more on the innovation side. I think we're going to see a lot more applications for outside technologies because people for the first time will be able to actually understand what we do. Sorry, I was thinking about your first question and I completely forgot the second one.
That's all right. When we communicate, I think, for you and I and everyone in the room, the 2.3 seconds to get a story, I think is fine. We all get that. I also suspect that in other environments, we need to be really careful what we assume people are thinking about and listening for and trying to understand. While yes, we're humans and we have a language and we want maybe the best for our families, what are if we can unpack our assumptions about messaging and benefits, I think that's an important place to start. Yeah. Okay. Do you have any, my final question was going to be, in terms of, we've talked, I think, a fair bit about some fairly common themes, but there might be some radical ideas or half-baked ideas that you think that the audience might want to hear at 4 o'clock on a Monday afternoon after a busy day. Are there any last suggestions that you would have?
So we did a study with Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment and the International Institute on Sustainable Development called Mining a Mirage, and it's very much trying to model what would happen with automation on local hiring, tax revenue, and that kind of thing. One of the conclusions that we came to was that there may be a need to shift some of the structural elements of how we mine. And so I might annoy some mining company staff in here, but I think that the technology providers, I guess you don't really care as long as you get paid. So, how it's mined doesn't really matter as long as it happens. I think you're going to see pressure on companies to change the way they're mined, whether it be production sharing agreements. I don't want to say nationalization, but I think it's more of a stake in government. So if the automation lowers tax revenue, it's not entirely unreasonable the government will want to see some of the benefits come their way. So I think again, it's not to advocate one way or the other, but I think, again, it's in the industry's interest to get ahead of this and understand what this could look like. And again, it may be shifting towards more production sharing agreements the same way that oil and gas is done, or it may be different tax formats. But I think that that's sort of the radical idea is that I think we're going to see some changes. And maybe it won't happen, but I think it's at least worth anticipating that coming up.
Thank you.
I think my view on what's going to happen with the sector as a whole is a lot of that change is going to come from the investor side. And there was a discussion in one of the panels earlier today, are these mining decisions or are these investor decisions? And someone in the crowd eloquently put it as, well, mining companies have consumers, and those consumers are essentially just consuming an investment product. The investor is the person who makes the decision here for us. And the way you put it is bang on. We need to get ahead of this, and innovation and the way we communicate with our local communities, our various stakeholders, regulators, whoever it may be, we need to be in front of that. But my belief is what's going to happen is you're going to see at some point when all this innovation takes shape and we actually start to have success stories from it. There's a lot of talk about electrification and automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning. We're just getting to the point, I believe, where we're going to start to hear about the success stories. But the day that you see the company, you say it's Barrick, and Barrick has a premium in its stock because of its innovative approach, and its multiple is better than Goldcorp's. That is an investor-led initiative. Everybody at Goldcorp, you're going to see that Goldcorp innovation budget triple overnight. Everybody at Goldcorp is going to be focused on what do we have to do to innovate. And I think that same mentality applies to how we approach stakeholders and everything else. As the world becomes more transparent, the company that is transparent and open with how it approaches its local communities and others, the second they're able to get a premium because of that, you're going to naturally see, whether it's right or wrong, kind of people will follow money. You're going to see other companies embrace that. And one underlying theme that we see more and more of is socially responsible investing. And what you're seeing is a lot of funds and institutions where a lot of the money sits that keeps our sector afloat. They have a growing component of be it their compliance or their investment committee, whatever it may be, where they need to make sure that the companies they're investing in are acting in the best interests of not just returns for shareholders, but also the communities they operate in. And I'm a big believer right across the board, from innovation to community engagement to kind of getting stakeholder and regulator support, whatever it may be. The day that investors start to reward companies for doing that, you're going to see every other company follow on, because everybody, whether we like it or not, everybody wants to have the highest multiple.
So just before I open the floor to questions of the panelists, I'd like to ask a question of the audience. Is there anyone in the audience who'd like to let us know, and the group know today, where they've seen particularly good examples of successful partnership, community support that we'd all like to hear about?
Thank you. My name's Sarah McLean, and I work for De Beers. And yes, we've had quite a bit of success in adapting our approach to community engagement in Canada and elsewhere in the world, but I know a little bit about what we do in Canada. Traditionally, we've had impact benefit agreements that we make those with Indigenous parties, but we've really moved away from that in recent years, and we're now moving more towards partnership agreements whereby Indigenous communities that are in the region around our mines actually become partners in the mine itself. We've accomplished that at Gachagua Mine through issuance of evergreen contracts where each Indigenous party will actually have a contract through the life of mine at our site. And of course, maintenance of those contracts are dependent on meeting performance targets. But it's really changed the relationship with some parties whereby they have a stake in the success of the mine as well. And looking at a new site that we have in play, we're hoping to move even beyond that. And so I was wondering, actually, from the panel, sounds like you have quite a bit of experience in other parts of the world, if you might discuss some business models that have worked well for partnering with Indigenous or local communities so that they become stakeholders in the mine, owners of the mine perhaps, or other models. Thank you.
I mean, I can start. I mean, I think when I think of Indigenous engagement, I think of Cameco in Saskatchewan. They, in my view, kind of invented a lot of this CSR stuff before it was cool because they were a uranium mining company and everybody was scared of uranium. So they really got ahead of this. They did the benefit agreements. They also, I visited their mines in Saskatchewan and we kept visiting their suppliers, and every single time we met the supplier, somebody on the supplier would have been a former Cameco employee or vice versa. And so they had a mutual interest, and the Cameco kept the mine succeeding because the suppliers were there for succeeding. I think the biggest model I see in that example and others is basically I don't want to dumb it down to a committee structure, but having regular engagement where the company is sitting down with the community and everyone's at the table saying, okay, you know, this year our goal is to increase these jobs or these procurement opportunities and targeting that. I think that to me is the structure, is setting up a regular ongoing community engagement committee around these specific targets. I think that's the way to do it. And I think that if you don't do that, if you just sign an agreement and there's nobody making the effort to connect the suppliers and connect the potential employees to the vocational institute, I think that's, you know, that's the recipe for failure. So I think that to me is the kind of overall model. But like I say, I mean, it's a very broad term, but essentially setting up those kind of committees, I think, is a real key model.
And sorry, just one on your point there. Specifically in regard to Indigenous groups, I think whether or not it's a specific business model, I think we just need to move away from the ticking the check, ticking the box mentality. And the example I'd give again is in Val-d'Or. We were in a heavily impacted mine site, and I'd remember, and my French is horrendous, so when we first sat down with this group, and I'm one of the only people in the room that don't speak French, I was kind of getting notes slipped to me about what was being said the entire time. But I remember this meeting vividly and going through, and it was essentially, we were almost being asked, what are you doing here? This site's, like the site that you're going after has been mined, it's got a big two tailings facilities on it. Why are you asking us for our buy-in? It was really interesting for us because we essentially, if we took that approach of let's tick the box, we could have walked away that day and never had anything else to do. But we had driven sort of 15 minutes out of town, and this community was just in complete disarray. And I'm sure many of the people here have visited Indigenous communities in Canada, and it's kind of embarrassing in a lot of ways that we can operate in these communities and not kind of, when we have the ability to change, that we don't do it. So we took that on, and I'm embarrassed to say I haven't followed up since our company got bought, but I believe the other group is carrying it forward. But we really made an effort to, again, putting ourselves, looking at the situation more from what do these people need, because it's not just a check. That's not going to do it for them. But what can we do? We ended up getting a few trained up on drill rigs and things like that. And that was nothing off us. That was the drill company that had to hire them. But it was more just the act of doing it more than anything else and just taking that approach to it. So I don't know if there's a specific business model so much as instead of dealing with the people across the table or in any consultation process as sort of a stepping stone to you getting to your permit that will allow you to make money, approaching it more from we're sitting here in an opportunity. If we're successful, there's going to be a ton of wealth creation, and it's just the logical human thing to do is to share it with some of these people that are going to be impacted by it.
Just a comment about community and a mining organization getting along together for a long time. Not to say that there hasn't been friction over the years, but not too far away from here, about 800 kilometers to the west in Salt Lake City, the Kennecott mine has grown up with the city of Salt Lake City. There's not a part of town you cannot see the mine from residences and businesses everywhere. Perhaps something that they have done that they used to do that should be perhaps reinstated. Back in the 60s and 70s, they had what they call the Kennecott Movie Night. Every Sunday night after the kids' TV shows were finished, there'd be a non-commercial movie would come on that was sponsored by Kennecott Copper, but the first 15 minutes was what happened at the mine this week? How much metal was produced? How many people were employed? How much money was paid out to these people? If there was an accident or not? And so on and so forth. The community and the mine knew exactly what was going on in both, and there was a lot of interaction and communication between them. Yes, there's been friction over the time, but in recent years, they've taken a lot of the surrounding lands, have turned them into community residences with planned communities and so on. There really isn't a negative per se, other than the typical minorities that protest any kind of development activities, but the synergy between the city of Salt Lake and the Kennecott mine is something that I think could be looked at very closely in terms of how does a major metropolitan area interact with in a major industrial complex.
I think it's a perfect example of thinking even just a little bit outside the box on how to get your message across. Because if you just had that 15-minute video play once a week, I don't think that many people would show up to see it. But I think it goes to show, and back to the comments on social media, there's a lot of tools that we can use, but we can't just assume that the tools themselves are the answer. But the innovative approach like that, I think it's a perfect example of how we can communicate. Because whether people like it or not, they might be there for the movie, but they're going to see 10 minutes of why Kennecott is an awesome company.
Hi, my name's Rolf Fandrich from the CSIRO. So we're the national research provider in Australia. I work for a group that's been looking at the phenomenon of social licence in extractives for about almost a decade now. And a lot of what's been said here resonates with the research that we've been doing in this area. So we've been defining social licence and coming up with tools which has culminated in a service that we're providing that delivers real-time social performance data about the relationship between a community and the mine. So in developing this service, we went through a rather intensive business model building exercise where we did customer discovery, so the whole Steve Blank thing of asking at least 100 customers about the value and all of that. So through this process of customer discovery, we went to the financiers and we asked them, do you guys think you own social risk? So this gets back to your comment about the finance sector and the relationship with the mining companies. And the answer to that question was a resounding no. They felt they had no obligation or the ability to manage social risk. So we found this quite interesting. You're giving mining companies hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and a little community can destroy a lot of value in a $1 billion asset. So can you elaborate on that, the relationship between the finance sector and the mining industry? Because our experience is that, or from the customer discovery process that we undertook, that responsibility of managing that particular risk was always put onto the mining company.
I mean, a general comment, I have to say, I think that there's a lot of progress being made on responsible investing. I do think it's overstated. I do think that a lot of it is a bit of fluff, and I think that yes, there are funds doing a better job, but the data shows that, I mean, Barclays stock went up after Libor, it didn't go down. BP, same after Deepwater Horizon, it went up, maybe not the next day, but there's not actually, structurally, we're a long way away from the point where companies are ever being sort of really punished for these kinds of things. So I think there's that element, and of course there's always a segment of the market which will always seek, frankly, unpleasant money from, whether that be Chinese state companies in the Congo, for example. So I think I think you have to accept that exists. I do think it's coming, and it will come, but I would say that it'll probably take a few disasters, shall we say, before it goes. And I don't mean necessarily, I don't mean a disaster in the context of the damage done to the community. I actually mean a disaster into the asset, and that's very much what's happened with Barrick, for example, in Argentina, where they said you were being in these high-profile cases where companies are being. I just think I saw another one this week being sued for, Exxon I think was being sued for a lack of climate risk in their asset. So I think I think that'll be, frankly, what changes things, is when a company's negligence gets punished for the stock. I don't think we would shift it. It's a bit pessimistic, I realize, but that's my.
So I would take probably a bit of a different stance on that. So looking at the financial sector, and I'll speak primarily to say institutional investors, like the BlackRocks of the world, the Van Ex. Like it's a very small group, and it's a shrinking pool of capital right now, but that'll change very quickly. If you look at what's made up of these, a lot of these institutions are made up of individual donors and people like ourselves, kind of either putting it through one or two different mediums to ultimately end up managed by one of these big funds. And whether it's because of a demographic shift and millennials care more about kind of, are more and more maybe disconnected from mines and care a little bit more about the environment and global warming or everything or anything else, or it's just the way the world is moving. I can tell you that it's a conversation. So in my role as both as the CEO of Integra Gold and then the chairman of Integra Resources, still spend a lot of time kind of in investor-facing meetings. It is absolutely a growing part, this socially responsible investing initiative. You'll have trouble finding anyone from on the banking side. You'll have trouble finding institutional salespeople that don't kind of that aren't having this conversation in the background with these funds. I don't think it doesn't surprise me that much that the feedback is really that the kind of the risk and the responsibility for what these individual mining companies do is offset. But again, we have to understand that the flow of information in the world is changing drastically every day and continues to increase. And everything that we do, whether we like it or not, is becoming more and more transparent every day. And we are going to be held as companies more and more accountable to the decisions we make, and the investment funds are going to become more transparent, and they're going to be held accountable to the companies that they invest in. Ultimately, they are chasing returns, but and a better example than myself is my wife. When we took our money after our company was bought, the first thing she asked was like, well, kind of as we're talking to RBC Royal Bank in Canada, what should we do with some of this and put into this or that? The first question she asked is, well, I just want to make sure it's green. Not even knowing what that meant, but to make sure that what we're investing in, at some way, we're not kind of funding some operation that's going to end up something that we can actually be proud of. And I think, I think we're seeing it, whether or not it's sort of that socially responsible investing initiative stops where it is and 5% of funds actually care and the rest don't, or it's growing. I believe it's going to grow and continue to grow. I believe we're moving kind of in the direction of just a world where everybody is held accountable to the decisions they make. And those big pockets of money that we rely on to fund our industry are reliant on little tiny pockets of individual money who actually really care about where their money ends up.
I think that's probably a really good place to draw the discussion to a close. I think that the bottom line is what I'm hearing, that collaboration, transparency, openness, engagement, and ultimately alignment with all of these groups, whether they're regulators or stakeholders, if we really want to achieve the benefits of what the extractive industry can deliver, it's going to absolutely be about our ability to generate this openness and alignment. So thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you.